Peter Edwards, welcome to ASPI.
Thanks.
All history, of course, is revision, but how much did you set out here to revise some of the common accepted views of Vietnam as a strategic error, even a moral mistake? How much did you want to argue that some of the things that Australia went to Vietnam for, the ideas of the domino theory or alliance interests, how much were you seeking to revise some of those arguments?
Well, I came to the project, which I started many years ago, with a pretty open mind in a way. But what struck me as I was working on it, as I've been working on it, is how much opinions have changed over the years and how much we've had to revise our own opinions particularly on the two major reasons why Australia did become involved. As you know, one theory was basically it was paying the premium on our strategic insurance with the United States, and that leads to the idea that it was all other people's wars, that we were basically fighting theirs, that we were supposedly all the way with LBJ in order to preserve the alliance. And one of the things that struck me as I worked on it was if you looked at it from the point of view of Robert Menzies and those closest to him, this was not a matter of us fighting America's wars. It was us getting America to fight Australia's wars, because the Australian government of the day genuinely believed, and with how much reason we'll come to in a moment, but they genuinely believed that this was about Australia's security.
And that is a big revision, isn't it? This argument that it wasn't us fighting their war, and you put this very succinctly, that in a sense Australia was getting America to fight an Australian war for Australian security.
The big fear of the Australian government at that time was that America would pull out of Southeast Asia. And of course we had the parallel situation going on of a confrontation in Indonesia, where our fear was that the British would pull out of Southeast Asia also. Now, as we know, the British did pull out of east of Suez. The Americans to some extent withdrew from Southeast Asia. But the big fear of the Australian government in the 1960s was that our two great and powerful friends would pull out of Southeast Asia in their respective areas. And what we were doing basically was using using the offer of battalions and other forces to keep our great and powerful allies interested in the region.
And perhaps a little more than you did in the official histories, you give some support to a grand strategy narrative about the domino effect, the idea that this was the war that was worth fighting because of what the knock-on effect could have been in the rest of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that's one of the great counterfactuals, if you like, one of the great what-ifs of history. What would have happened if Saigon had fallen in 1965 instead of 1975, as almost certainly would have happened if there had not been massive American and Allied intervention in the mid-60s. We can't really know, but I think it is pretty clear that the regional impact would have been much wider than it was. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the countries of Southeast Asia would have fallen in a rigid succession like the proverbial dominoes, up to and including Australia and New Zealand. But it does mean that the regional balance of power would have been very different. We shouldn't forget, for example, that in the early 60s there was quite a substantial communist insurgency in northeast Thailand, opposite Laos. And so if Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia had all fallen, so to speak, in the mid-60s, the impact on Thailand would have been a lot worse than it was by 1975. And the big question of all, which we can only raise, we can never answer, but the big question is, would the Indonesian generals have had the fortitude to stand up to the coup, the attempted coup of 30th September 1965, if the United States and the West had not indicated that they were prepared to make a stand in Vietnam?
So we might not have had Pol Pot in Cambodia, but we might have had a very different Indonesia. We might not have had ASEAN being created, for instance.
Exactly. So what I'm arguing is that and incidentally, on the domino theory, the person who's pushed that argument the hardest, that the 10-year gap really made a huge difference. The person who's pushed that hardest is Kuan Yew. And as Robert Thompson used to say during the Vietnam War, if you want to ask about the domino theory, ask the dominoes. Well, Kuan Yew was very clear about that, and he's always said that the West did the right thing by staying as long as they did. In fact, he got very nervous during the last years of the war when it looked like the Americans might pull out. So there is that argument. But the Indonesian impact is much more the case for Australia, much more important for Australia than it ever was for the United States, for example. So the really interesting thing is that we were getting the United States, as I say, to stand in Southeast Asia because we were seriously afraid of what the ramifications would have been for Southeast Asia had they not done so.
It raises an interesting question. If you accept that Australia was essentially getting the Americans to fight a war that was in Australia's interests, that this was an Australian war much more than it was an American war, why was there such little blowback in terms of the alliance? Why did the alliance come through so well and, in a sense, that insurance premium argument come true in Vietnam, that the alliance did survive and did grow after Vietnam?
That wasn't the only story to it. I mean, it is certainly clear that the Americans did want allies. I mean, the Americans had decided for their own reasons, essentially, that they did feel they had to make a stand, that they did have to go in, although there was plenty of debate about it, and the debate between the Hawks and the Doves was intense. But I think they basically decided that on their own ground, so to speak, not because Australia was pressing them, but it did make a difference that there were respectable allies like Australia and New Zealand involved with them, and that had a huge impact on American domestic politics. And American governments used that to keep Australia in. But you could see after a while that the Australians started to feel that they had, this was not going to go so well, and they couldn't keep raising the commitment to the level that the Americans wanted. The trouble with to get back to the domino theory argument, though, a lot of the benefits that Australia received, and indeed the whole region received, were already evident by about 1968-69. The real tragedy of Vietnam, as I would argue, is not that America and its allies went in 1965, and particularly from the Australian point of view, it's not that we made a commitment then. I think we would have had to. I think we had to, as it was seen as in our interests, and we were under enormous pressure from the Americans as well. But the benefits, the regional benefits, were already evident by about 67, 68, 69. ASEAN had been formed, Indonesia was under a different regime, Malaysia and Singapore were a lot more stable than had appeared to be the case, and they had the big split in 1965 also. So the regional situation was very different. The real tragedy, as I see it, from both the American and the Australian point of view, is that the war was allowed to go on so long. And if you look at what the Americans were saying during the 1968 presidential campaign, leading Republicans and Democrats alike were pointing to the fact that Southeast Asia looked very different already from what it had looked like in 64, 65. But Nixon and Kissinger were not able to get America out of the war or to end the war on anything like satisfactory terms until 1972, 73.
And this is where you're, I think, in some ways hardest on the Australian judgment involved in Vietnam, that the Australian commitment was, in your words, far too much faith placed in American military power and far too little questioning of what the mission was going to be and what an exit strategy might even look like.
Yes. I think there are two major things. One, there was a particularly important meeting in early 65 where to discuss strategy, Australia, New Zealand and United States in Honolulu. And Menzies sent no diplomats, he only sent basically one representative, and that was Sir Frederick Sherger, who was chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee, who was pretty gung-ho.
A hawk's hawk.
He was a hawk's hawk, exactly. And he frankly disregarded the brief that he had been given, which had been prepared by the senior advisors and signed off by the senior ministers, which said you go on a no commitment basis. You're not to make any commitment, you're to ask questions about the American strategy. It posed all the right questions. How are the Americans going to handle the possibility that the South Vietnamese might pull back? What do we really know about Hanoi's policies and Beijing's strategies and so on? He didn't ask any of those questions. He just said, I think America wants an Australian battalion and we're going to send an Australian battalion. And I got this from the New Zealand documents. They were amazed by the way he performed at that. And they said that he could only have done that if he was acting on what he knew to be the Prime Minister's wishes, contrary to what senior ministers and advisors were actually saying.
If Australia's purpose was in Vietnam about the alliance, and the alliance in the end, despite the failure in Vietnam, came out looking pretty good, is that the calculus that can be also applied to debates now about Afghanistan? If Afghanistan, like Vietnam, ends up being a long but failed war, but the alliance with the US is strengthened and burnished, is that grand strategy delivering?
I think it probably is deliberate, and I suppose you can say that you can look at a couple of prime ministers the way they seem to be playing it. First of all, I think of Julia Gillard, who was making her first visit to Washington and the White House as Prime Minister in, I think it was March 2011, and the announceable that day was that Australia would be donating $3 million of Australian taxpayers' money towards the American Vietnam Veterans Education Centre in Washington to make sure there was a strong Australian component. In other words, we were reminding the Americans that they had a loyal ally in this most controversial of wars. Now, nobody in the 1970s or early 80s would have thought it possible that any Prime Minister, certainly not a Labor Prime Minister, would take that sort of step. But clearly, Prime Ministers these days, of whatever political persuasion, are more than happy to be able to stand beside the President of whatever persuasion and say, we Australians have stood beside you Americans in every major war of the 20th century and now the 21st century. So we were involved in Afghanistan at the time that Julia Gillard said that. So clearly that's the message that has come through.
How much can you in fact make some comparisons between Vietnam, Australia's longest war of the 20th century, and now Afghanistan, our longest war? What sort of linkages or comparisons would you make?
Well, there are comparisons and there are contrasts. The comparison is, and this is the way that some Americans, like Richard Haas, who was here recently, would say they would put Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan in the same boat as examples of where the Americans had looked through a particular situation looked at local situation through a global prism and underestimated the impact of local politics when they were thinking in grand global terms, the Cold War or the war against terror or whatever. I think that element certainly applies. I mean, you can say of all of them, it can be argued that this was the wrong battlefield to pick in a justified global conflict, but a good general picks his battlefield, and this was not the best place to pick that battlefield. There are different situations, of course. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we weren't going in to support a government that was already in place. And President Obama recently said the fault with Iraq, and I suspect he may think the same about Afghanistan, but is not yet able to say it, is that you cannot impose democracy by force. In Vietnam was a little different because the Americans weren't seeking to impose democracy by force. They were seeking to defend a regime which, for all its flaws, had certain aspirations towards democracy. And it wasn't just an anti-communist government. It purported to aspire to being a genuine democratic regime in the fullness of time. The other lesson that seems to have been learnt, though, is I look very closely at Tony Abbott's statement at the end of when we pulled soldiers out of Afghanistan.
Not a defeat.
But we hope it's left a better result, for some time. That seems to me a very clever way of saying, if it does go belly up after a certain time, well, we did warn you, but at least we have we've raised the possibility of a better result in the long term, and we've done a good job. We've done the best job we can.
A very problematic, equivocal way of saying it. We didn't win, but we didn't lose.
Yes. And it's covering himself so that if all goes bad in a year or two's time, he can't have that held against him, so to speak.
Which brings me to the point made in his memoirs by Peter Cosgrove. Peter Cosgrove, lieutenant in Vietnam, went on to be Chief of the Army, Chief of the Defence Force, launched your book, about to become the Governor-General. In his memoirs, Peter Cosgrove said, in retrospect, we should not have gone to Vietnam. He said that we lost, and we mustn't do that with our men and women. And my advice to leaders is to never take the war decision lightly, and having done so, never stop until the outcome is worth the cost. That point, in retrospect, we should not have gone to Vietnam. Your view?
I think it's very interesting coming from him, but we also remember that he was CDF at the time. He was Chief of Army, I think, at the time of the commitment to Afghanistan, and CDF at the time of the commitment to Iraq. I would qualify it somewhat by saying that one of the major lessons to learn is how you handle a commitment. What I'm very critical of is the all or nothing style of it, the open-ended nature of the commitment. Now, I do mention in the book comparing Vietnam with the Iraq commitment. And as I say, it may or may not be significant that Cosgrove was CDF at the time of the Iraq commitment. But if you look how cleverly John Howard handled the commitment to Iraq, and in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, we had not been saying to the Americans, this is a real problem, you must stay here, as we had about Vietnam. That's one of the biggest contrasts between Vietnam and Iraq or Afghanistan. But John Howard clearly decided we had to go into Iraq. That wasn't for our own regional security. That was a matter of alliance management very heavily. But he went in fast and he got out fast. He made sure that our forces were fighting in their own area so that they were not too much enmeshed with the American warfighting machine, which didn't suit our style of operations. He ensured that we had key people in the decision-making process, in the decision-making structure. As I say, the exit strategy. And above all, we had no conscripts. And so much of the controversy around Vietnam was about the national service system that was operating at the time, rather than the war itself. As soon as conscripts were no longer being sent, the protest movement evaporated. Now, there was a time in, I think it was 2006, when a retired Chief of the Defence Force, Admiral Barry, raised the idea of conscription, just looked at the demographics and said to Australia might have to think about conscription to meet our commitments. And John Howard, as Prime Minister, sat on it very firmly. It didn't last 24 hours in the media cycle. He knew how important conscription was. So if you look at the way that John Howard handled the Iraq commitment, even though, as I say, it was much less of an Australian mission or an Australian objective than Vietnam was, because it was so much further away, but he handled it so much more cleverly that he didn't suffer the political drawbacks, the political costs that Menzies and Menzies' successors in the Liberal Party did suffer from the Vietnam commitment.
The contrast that you draw very strongly is between the skill and the independence that Australia showed in confrontasi with Indonesia from 63 to 66 against the almost naivety and the short-sightedness of the approach in Vietnam. How would you contrast those two sets of plays by the same government?
It's quite astonishing because they were going on at the same time. As you say, it's the same government, the same ministers and advisors, and in some cases the same meetings of cabinet ministers, the relevant cabinet committees and so forth. They were discussing both issues. And yet, if you look at the contrast between them, it's quite astonishing. In the one case, the Foreign Service was deployed very effectively. It had a considerable impact. In part, that was because we had a minister in Garfield Barwick who later, of course, became Chief Justice of the High Court, but he got on very well with his diplomats, and he was able to stand up to the Prime Minister and say, no, we have to handle this issue in a very careful way. Yes, we must resist Indonesia, but we must do it in a way which keeps open relationships so that, because we're always going to be Indonesia's next door neighbours, and so it's important to use the minimum force. And in fact, we kept diplomatic relations open, we kept aid relations open, we kept military exchanges open, even while Australian and Indonesian soldiers were fighting each other.
So it's quite a subtle and an independent use of Australian diplomacy.
And independent.
And while at the same time Australian soldiers were fighting Indonesian solgers along the Malaysian frontier.
And at the same time, while we were doing it to encourage the British, who had far more power, far more assets in the region than we did, and so we were doing it to keep the British involved in their commitment, but at the same time, we were challenging the British strategies, their diplomatic and military approaches. We were telling them, no, your assessments are wrong. They kept asking for troops, and we kept saying, well, no, we're not ready to send combat troops yet. And then we sent engineers, and it was a very graduated response was the line. And we did none of that with Vietnam. I think part of it is the fact that Menzies, I think Menzies got a bit impatient with that approach towards Indonesia. And Menzies also, I think, was overawed by American power. Now, if you remember that Menzies was a young man becoming politically conscious during the last years of the First World War. He was Prime Minister from April 1939 to August 1941. Now, if you or I had been in that position, I think we might well think that the important thing in any major conflict is to get the Americans in. Once they become involved, then it's all over.
Who's going to win.
You know who's going to win. Yeah. The Americans can't lose. The real problem is American isolationism.
Well, there's still quite a few Australians who would still make that argument quite strongly today.
Yeah. It's there is that isolationist strand is always there in American thinking. Wasn't it Thomas Jefferson who said America does not go abroad to seek monsters to conquer? And that idea is still strong in the American psyche. So it's understandable, but I think it was a huge mistake for Menzies and Shergar, his closest advisor, to think that the Americans could not lose. The crucial thing is to get the Americans in. And I can remember, I'm dating myself, but I can remember when the Americans went in, a lot of the people just saw the might, the fleets of aircraft, the massive numbers of people and so forth, and they said, well, this is this is all over. No country, North Vietnam or any other country, can't stand up to this. They can't be expected to lose. And I think that is why the Menzies and Holt in his first year sort of took the view that this was, it's a matter of just getting on board, we're going to be on the winning side. Holt's second year was very different, and from then on it was, we found it very difficult to get out. But that was partly because Menzies and Holt had handled the escalation of the commitment and the initial commitment in such a way that they hadn't imposed an exit strategy. They hadn't said to the Americans, for example, well, we'll send you, 1 battalion or 2 battalions, but they'll have to come out in 2 years' time or anything like that. They hadn't imposed any conditions on it. And I think they were wrong and ill-advised to have allowed that to happen.
50 years on, what lessons does Vietnam offer to 21st century Australia?
I think it's, as the Bishop said to the actress, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. It's not just the sheer fact. We tend to focus so much on the decision it's right or it's wrong, and to a certain degree that's understandable. But the way you handle the commitment is so important. I mean, we did send a battalion, in early 65, we sent 1 battalion to confrontation and another battalion to Vietnam. But the way we handled those commitments was just so different that we should look at them now almost as case studies, in the one case of how to do it, in the other case how not to do it. It's not that we said, no, we can't do this. It's you put conditions around it, you impose rules of engagement, you assert exit strategies, you accompany it all the time by high-level diplomacy and military-to-military talks to find out what is really going on. I think one of the problems about Vietnam, for example, in comparison with Indonesia, is that on the one hand, we didn't know enough about what was going on in the region. We didn't have diplomatic representation in Hanoi or Beijing, so we were looking at their propaganda rather than getting behind the scenes. We couldn't, whereas in Malaysia and Indonesia, we had very effective diplomatic representatives and we were really doing independent diplomacy. Also, we knew far more about British strategy and were able to argue the toss with them at both political and military levels. We had no idea what the Americans were doing. We didn't really ask what their strategy was, and at that Honolulu meeting that I mentioned earlier, they couldn't have answered the question what their strategy was because they hadn't worked it out themselves.
And of course, in terms of alliance management or alliance insurance, it's part of it is about what you ask for and part of it is about what you wish for. And in the way Australia managed its alliance or paid the alliance dues, Vietnam has continuing messages for Australia about how it approaches the American alliance.
Oh, very much so, very much so. That it's a matter of managing the alliance. Whereas immediately after Vietnam, there was such a huge reaction against it that the alliance itself was on the nose politically, and it was a real battle for the people in the system, so to speak, to point to other benefits of the alliance, not just the strategic insurance, but the intelligence and the access to science and technology and so forth. Now I think we do understand, I think we do, I hope we do, that alliance management is something that has to be constantly maintained. You can't just accept American assessments or assurances. We have to make our own decisions, and we do that on a continuing basis. We don't bruit it abroad too loudly if we have disagreements, but it is something that has to be managed, and we have to manage our own, and we have to make our own assessments based on our own opinion, and based one hopes on a good diplomatic service in which the government has confidence, and that's a very relevant lesson for today, to make our own assessments of what's happening in the region and in areas where sometimes we may have more expert knowledge than the Americans do.
And on that note, Peter Edwards, thank you.
Pleasure.